Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the New Movie Diary, in which I tell you about new, recent, and up-and-coming releases and try to give you straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. Another week, another crop of new movies, and another episode of the New Movie Diary where I am coming to you, my dear viewers, anybody watching right now, utterly dismayed, completely caught off guard, totally enamored with not just one, but two movies that I saw this past Thursday in a back-to-back double feature. The first being No Hard Feelings, starring Jennifer Lawrence, which from the trailers I was not expecting to think too highly of, or at least not nearly as highly as I do after having seen it. I don't know, maybe someone else out there will know what I mean by this, but while I thought Jennifer Lawrence looked very charming in the trailers for this, looked very committed to doing a performance in a certain style of popular comedy that we're really not used to seeing her in, I generally get kind of a bad vibe from a lot of the sorts of movies that kind of keep recurring intermittently ever since Bridesmaids kind of broke the glass ceiling of the bad girl comedies, these sorts of crude, Vulgarian comedies in which a huge part of the selling point is that it's women comedians and comic actors leading and headlining in the sorts of movies that are generally considered to be more for guys. As a matter of fact, if you end up going to see No Hard Feelings, you'll end up getting no shortage of relentless advertisements for similar, or at least similar appearing bad girl comedies, lest we think of Bottoms or Joyride, both coming out this summer. But from the very beginning of the bad girl comedy cycle, there has been, I think, a rather unmistakable tendency for every once in a while to get a bad girl film that basically casts certain actresses, particularly when they aren't really known for popular, especially more vulgar or crude comedies, just for the marquee or the star power of it, but not really for their appropriateness to a certain role. So seeing the way No Hard Feelings was advertised, which definitely emphasizes aspects of it that present as a more crude film, a more vulgar film, a more kind of masochistic, slapstick kind of thing where Jennifer Lawrence is getting pepper sprayed in the face and cold-cocked in the throat and fumbling around, I get a kind of weird vibe because I know it can go one of two ways. One is that it's just a good movie. An actor really surprises you with a certain tonal range that you didn't really expect from them. Melissa McCarthy is kind of right along with Bridesmaids the premier example of that. Someone who probably more than any other actor is synonymous with the bad girl comedy, who kind of became its typecast queen for a while before she started breaking out into more strictly dramatic stuff again. And the other is that it's like an incredibly awkward situation, like Hot Pursuit situation, in which it really does seem more like stunt casting, where it doesn't really seem like anyone behind the camera is really serious about playing to the respective strengths of a performer and molding the comedic sense of the film around them, and instead just has them doing like this faux improv thing where at its worst it can feel like in editing they just left a bunch of jokes that they knew weren't funny and they knew weren't going to land because they just needed to pad out the runtime of the thing. I mean, honestly, it doesn't help that so many comedies these days are purely driven by a kind of stream of consciousness, pop culture reference heavy and non sequitur dialogue, and if you've seen my last video review of The Blackening, you know that this is something that really annoys me about contemporary comedy, the lack of willingness to really explore situational comedy and physical comedy more. And as far as situational humor and physical humor, I don't even just mean gross out scenes or big set pieces. I'm strictly talking in terms of how everything from camera movement to editing to sound design can help layer the comedic potential of a story without anybody having to say anything, to not just present a funny story, but to tell a story in a funny way. And at the end of the day, that's not just a problem with bad girl comedies, but it becomes especially pronounced feeling in the bad girl comedy because there's also this extent to which that it just feels like there is just a dramatic imbalance in terms of how conventionally attractive you have to be in order to headline or even just be a major supporting cast member in a bad girl comedy versus what the standards are for men. And I mean, let's be real here, even if it's primarily presented as an affect of her character, a big part of casting Jennifer Lawrence, this extremely successful actress, as a hot mess character, a big part of it is just as much the hot part as the mess part. And so immediately I've kind of got my cynical cap on, and I end up asking myself basically one of two obverse but related questions. The first is the primary joke about this character that they are not conventionally attractive by contemporary sexist standards? And the second, the obverse, is there even a joke here? Or are we just kind of casting hot girls in roles they aren't suited for because whether it's men or women seeing this comedy, there's this double standard that nobody seems to want to see women talk, even to be funny, unless they're nice to look at. And the majority of comedic filmmakers, especially the kinds that every major studio has on speed dial when one type of new comedy makes the big bucks and kicks in the imitation engines into overdrive. The majority of comedic filmmakers, at least these days, are just genuinely not prepared to tell a funny story at all, to think of who they cast in a role primarily from the perspective of they're performing a clearly defined character that they can inhabit and perform with a sense of naturalism, even when it's a exaggerated, highfalutin comedy. And not just, well, she's funny because, okay, look, maybe she's funny on a talk show, maybe she's funny when you're bantering behind the scenes, maybe she's even a good comedian, but there's a big difference between someone being funny in terms of just saying funny things or telling a funny story or improvising something clever in a specific context or an opportune moment, and then someone being funny because their performance of a character is working within an overall comedic context where it's not just them spouting vulgarities and making pop culture references. And I already kind of gave the game away by saying that I liked No Hard Feelings a lot more than I was expecting, so why don't we stop wasting time and just break down what this little movie is all about. No Hard Feelings stars Jennifer Lawrence as Maddie, an Uber driver and a bartender in her early 30s living by herself in the scenic port city of Montauk, New York. She lives in a house that her single mother left to her after she died, and that she is now being faced with it being foreclosed upon because she has not been able to pay the rising property taxes created by all the wealthy families moving into Montauk and buying up prime real estate and thus gentrifying the area and driving out the locals. The bank repossesses Maddie's car, which means her second source of income is gone, and so she responds to a Craigslist ad put out by two well-off parents, newbies, played by Matthew Broderick and Laura Benanti, who are seeking a woman to date their anxiety-ridden and introverted 19-year-old son, Percy, Andrew Barth Feldman, in order to help him out of his shell before he goes off to Princeton at the end of the summer. In return for her services, including implied sexual services, Maddie will get a new car. At first, as you might expect, Maddie really plays into the role of a kind of pornographic fantasy. She goes to the dog shelter where Percy volunteers and attempts to seduce him, but over time, as she and Percy start dating, as they get to know each other, Maddie starts to take to heart that this sort of racy one-night stand just isn't what he wants. She learns more about why he's so socially withdrawn, and she learns to sympathize with him as more than just a means to an end. And so, of course, in turn, Percy starts developing romantic feelings for Maddie, which, of course, presents its own complications as he does start to come out of his shell and be his own person, but just not in the way that his parents intended. I said as you might expect, and of course, a couple couple times there. And look, No Hard Feelings is not reinventing the wheel here, but I think the first thing I should say is that while the narrative of the film isn't precisely unpredictable, while as far as sex comedies go, it has a pretty formulaic arc of following Jennifer Lawrence as this very cynical and messy character whose heart begins to be drawn out and who sees the error of her ways, and then Feldman's character, on the other hand, starts learning how to stand up for himself and be his own man, yada yada. No Hard Feelings is not breaking any new ground here, but I do have to say that as far as a rather formulaic sex comedy, it is nonetheless a very intelligently written, well-acted, and most surprisingly of all, really consummately produced sex comedy. Because as I alluded above, so many sex or crude comedies these days are so entirely cynical, they really pander to the audience's expectations that what they're there for is the lowbrow humor, and there's not a lot of beyond the most superficial investment in developing character and getting you invested in a story beyond the crude, again, mostly dialogue-driven humor. No Hard Feelings is a really special film in that, I must say, it hasn't really been accurately advertised to audiences. I feel like there are a lot of people who are going to be going into this movie expecting a more cynical kind of lowbrow comedy, but what they're actually going to get out of it is a much more slowly paced movie, not, sloth paced, but, more drawn out, that has more of a character focus and also derives much more of its humor not only from situational ironies. The entire sequence of events of Lawrence basically trying to be this pornographic fantasy of an older woman seducing a teenager is really quite well done, and not only plays really well with how situationally these sorts of fantasies just come off as not only so awkward and forced, but really kind of creepy and predatory in a real-world scenario, but also plays really well off of Feldman playing a character who is not just a cynical stereotype of a sex-starved nerd, as somebody who is part of a generation of younger adult men who, while they may be very isolated and withdrawn and atomized by modern life and social media, actually have the potential for having much more mature and, it should be said, ethical and feminist expectations of how men are supposed to treat women, and not only that, but about how women are supposed to act so that guys can get to know them for reasons other than just them being objects of sexual fulfillment. And as far as the prerequisite sort of gross out or raunchy scenes that take up so much of the publicity for this film, it should also be said that not only because the context around them is so dramatically tight, but the scenes themselves, the more bawdy set pieces themselves, are not only rather creative, but are exceedingly well executed and are giving the performers much more to do than simply falling into gauche pratfalls. There really is an extraordinary amount of attention paid by the filmmakers in not just having the raunchy scenes be one-off set pieces, but to have them serve a dramatic purpose or a character purpose, to work within the story and to work within the sense of expanding and layering upon the various themes of the film. I think the first sense that I got that the filmmakers behind this were really going for something different was in the scene where Maddie, Lawrence's character, first arrives at Percy's parents' house to meet them, and looking at the house they're living in, the thing that struck me is how it looks almost exactly like the house that the rich people live in Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. And I'm just sitting here thinking, is this American sex comedy alluding to Parasite? And while No Hard Feelings is certainly not some deeply blackly comic satire of class inequality and modern cynicism, I don't think it's a mistake. There is a running theme throughout this movie about gentrification, about the normalization of sex work within the context of a really cynical and inequitable society. And I don't want to harp too much on that. I'm just introducing that as, again, just as a kernel of a suggestion of what is informing this movie from a much more nuanced, creative perspective than audiences are used to with your average sex comedy, or especially the average bad girl movie. And as far as that goes, this is definitely one of the best bad girl comedies we've had in a while, at least since Bridesmaids, because the filmmakers haven't just stuck Jennifer Lawrence, this woman who really exploded as a star because of both the Hunger Games and X-Men franchises, but has still consistently consistently attempted to do more challenging and offbeat dramatic and experimental performances, whether it's her consistent collaborations with director David O. Russell or in Darren Aronofsky's Mother. They haven't just taken this famous, conventionally attractive woman celebrity and played the movie off the stunt casting of just turning her into a hot mess. This is a strong character story that plays to Lawrence's strengths as a star and as a strong dramatic lead first and foremost. And it's especially refreshing and surprising because when you look behind the camera, when you look to the development and production side of No Hard Feelings, I really can't explain where this surprisingly really good dramatic comedy is coming from. It's directed by a guy named Gene Stupnitsky and co-written by Stupnitsky and John Phillips. Stupnitsky really got his start as a producer and writer for The Office, and the thing is that he really has made his bones as a comedic writer working on the side of the much more baseline and cynical kind of crude comedy. He's often collaborated with another writer and producer, Lee Eisenberg. They helped co-write Year One, which is a sort of fascinatingly misjudged Apatow Productions movie that nobody seems to remember. They also co-wrote Bad Teacher together and then worked on the TV series based on it, and most recently they co-wrote and Stupnitsky also directed Good Boys, that hard R coming-of-age movie from 2019, which made a lot of money and was relatively well-reviewed, but honestly I think is a really terrible, dumb, gross, and worst of all, a terminally unfunny movie that is probably one of the worst distillations of the trend of really cynical, crude comedies of late. Phillips, his co-writer, on the other hand, was also a producer of Good Boys, as well as a writer and producer for that equally awful Robert De Niro, Zac Efron vehicle, Dirty Grandpa. And look, I get that comedy is relative. What you guys find funny isn't going to be the same as what I find funny and vice versa, but I really can't express enough how, with both of these guys, Stupnitsky and Phillips, it's not just that I don't find what they have done in the past to be funny, it's that I kind of viscerally don't respect it, especially Good Boys, which is such a terrible, gross, cynical, and even kind of creepy movie that it actually kind of depresses me how much people seem to like it, or I guess just kind of got suckered in by the perceived novelty of it. So I'm really kind of flummoxed by how good this new film by them turned out to be, not just on the writing side, but as far as Stupnitsky on the directing side is concerned, because there are so many aspects of this film's production that not only far exceed the average sex comedy or bad girl movie, but specifically so far in a way blow everything that Stupnitsky has done previously out of the water, whether as a writer or as a director. If I didn't know better and you had told me that No Hard Feelings was directed by the same guy who directed Good Boys, number one, I probably wouldn't have bothered to see it. I also would have not believed you after seeing it, specifically because Good Boys is such a lazy, shoddily done production that banks so hard on just the most cynical kind of crude comedic premise, and which has just an absolutely revolting lack of genuine investment in character and in giving its cast something to work with at a dramatic level. But No Hard Feelings is not just taking Jennifer Lawrence and having her be a hot mess and spout vulgar one-liners. Stupnitsky's direction is so character-focused and so patient and so much more drawn out in terms of telling the story cinematically and not just through jumping from one scenario to another. There's this one scene where Maddie and Percy are on a date in a fancy restaurant where Percy gets up and plays Hall & Oates' Man-Eater on the piano, and I usually hate scenes in contemporary comedies where it's just an excuse to shoehorn in an anachronistic pop hit that, in context, is never really that anachronistic, and of course is just a reference, it's never really funny. But the use of Man-Eater in No Hard Feelings is actually pretty clever, and again, really remarkably character and thematic dramatically engaged and interesting. And beyond that, Stupnitsky and Eigil Brild, the cinematographer, give Lawrence this really well done zoom into a close-up as Feldman is playing and singing, and it's really such a pure distillation of how the people behind the camera are showing an appreciation for star power and dramatic leading that even some of the better bad girl movies just fail to even contemplate. And quite frankly, the more bitter irony is that with just that one effective shot, this filmmaker, who I have no reason to suspect of having anything to contribute creatively to filmmaking as a craft or the culture of cinema more broadly, much less comedy, just in this one effective shot, he not only draws you more into the story, but he kind of presents you with this shocking reminder of, oh, right, Jennifer Lawrence is a really good actress. And she's not just a good actress. She's a star. She pulls the focus in such an uncanny and charismatic way. And so suddenly, in the context of this crude bad girl comedy, I'm thinking, like, nobody, even the more highbrow art house field, has treated Lawrence this seriously as a star in years, has respected her enough to give her, even in the context of this relatively crude, relatively formulaic sex comedy, a slick, dramatic star moment. And maybe there should be more credit to Eigil Brild as the cinematographer of this movie. He's definitely got a wide body of work. He's also the cinematographer for that awful-looking Bert Kreischer movie that came out this year. But he was also, like, the director of photography for In Bruges and Tulip Fever. And so it's like, okay, you don't just want to make a sex comedy. You don't just want to make a cynical cash grab banking on a big star playing against type. You want a real movie and something that looks like a real movie. So you get a real cinematographer, not just a guy who can set up a digital camera in one of the million free real estate up for grabs homes that are populating California for on-location shooting. But even beyond that, Stupnitsky's writing and direction in this is really quite clever and really creative and invested in telling a story and realizing the potential of a production to build up the comedic potential of something that otherwise you could easily imagine, even with respect to Stupnitsky's own past directing, as being done very flatly and very haphazardly and without a lot of care or consideration. It should also be said that for as much as the publicity is kind of overselling the vulgarity of the movie, especially Lawrence's performance in slapstick scenes, it has to be said that she really does give her all in this movie. There are some truly cool and incredible comedic set pieces and slapstick scenes, which I'm not going to give away in context because I have to say there is one in particular at the climax, which again really is rather brilliantly contextualized into the drama of the story and isn't just a one-off gag or a set piece, but which whoever was Lawrence's stunt double in the scene really deserves some credit. And in a summer where Mission Impossible and Tom Cruise has been all up in our grill about, hey, look at me try to kill myself again, it really gives you a new appreciation for how the best done action set pieces, the best done stunts, are not necessarily the biggest ones. They're the ones that work well within the context of an overall story and that you appreciate all the more because while they don't come out of nowhere precisely, there's an adequate balance between the more understated and grounded stuff and then the big slapstick payoff. And that, again, Stupnitsky directs really, really well. No hard feelings. I think I'll give this one a well-deserved 3.5 out of 5. A really surprisingly good sex comedy that is really more of a refreshingly intelligent and creative dramatic comedy that is much more worthy of your time than whatever blockbuster slop is being held over from last week. Oh man, it is really hot out today, and not just hot, it's humid. I'm not gonna lie. I'm dying for you here, folks. I'm like, you can tell, can't you? Like, I'm barely able to breathe out here. That's how heavy the air is. Like, I'm suffering to give you these reviews, okay? So just know that. Even if you disagree with everything I say, just know I am suffering so that you can disagree with me out here, okay? Anyway, I did see a second feature this past Thursday, none other than Asteroid City, the latest feature film by Wes Anderson, which technically premiered on June 16th, but is now branching out to mainstream theaters in a pretty big push from the U.S. distributor Focus Features. Wes Anderson is obviously a very prominent, a very much revered, but also a very polarizing independent filmmaker. Got his start all the way back in the late 90s with Bottle Rocket, experienced subsequent critical breakthroughs with Rushmore and the Royal Tenenbaums. With The Life Aquatic, created what was not actually very well received at the time, but has subsequently become his first real cult success, and is considered by many, myself included, to be something of his magnum opus as a filmmaker, but has in the entirety of his career really progressively honed and distilled an incredibly unique style of filmmaking, not only in terms of its writing, with a very ironic sense of humor, a real deadpan and affected approach to writing dialogue, the really sharp juxtaposition between kind of whimsical and humorous scenarios and moments of really stark melancholy and even violence at times, but also in terms of their visual presentation, especially in terms of what has come to be seen as Anderson's almost diorama-like approaching to the construction of shots, with very bold use of colors, very meticulous and eccentric compositions of not only sets, but also props and costumes, as well as the characters in the shot themselves, oftentimes with a sense of a kind of anti-naturalism, where everything feels very artificial and unreal in terms of how Anderson at once can seem to present a scene so fully, but also really challenge our sense of the spatial realism or the depth of an image. I could go on and on trying to describe Anderson's style, but at a certain point it's kind of moot, because even to people who are relatively unfamiliar with his works personally, he's grown in stature as a totally independent filmmaker whose style is so distinct and so refined that oftentimes, even in the period we're in now, where it seems like there are so many social media and TikTok influencers or AI artists now attempting to imitate his style, even their attempts at imitation only serve to really underscore how singular and inimitable Anderson's style really is. And Anderson's style is no small reason for why he's proven to be such a polarizing filmmaker, and even, it should be said, polarizing among people who even tend to love his movies. The really funny thing is that, and I don't think I'm alone in this, there's an extent to which, even if you very much respect Anderson as an artist, even if you generally like or love his films, there's an extent to which the memification of his style contributes to an intermittent malaise about it, an understanding, rightly or wrongly, of his simply repeating himself and progressively alienating audiences from really being able to get into his works for reasons aside from their style of humor or their aesthetic presentation. I even felt this in the build-up to the release of Asteroid City myself, and I'm one of these people who seems to be on the lesser half of the Anderson fandom, where I actually think that Anderson's more recent films, his later body of work, the work from the period of his more refined and, let's say, dictatorial style, I'm of the camp where I generally think it's much better than his earlier, more seminal works. And even still, no matter how much I like or even love an Anderson film, when he makes a new one, it isn't long being without one and then seeing the publicity for his next one before I kind of strangely forget how much of a hook there is to his style and his unique kind of storytelling, where I myself, as someone who loves his films, even feel a kind of internal slight, like, oh, really? We're doing this again, Wes? So I wasn't even necessarily going into Asteroid City with the highest of expectations, but I guess that ultimately speaks to Anderson's great strength as not just a filmmaker, but as one of the premier stylists in filmmaking, where there is this really profound tension between whether or not his style actually helps to tell a story or express a theme or depict a subject, or if his style only describes the form of itself. And Anderson's style is so unique and so inimitable that it kind of has that ironic effect of, even if you love his works, it always leaves you on edge for the next effort, always leaves you in this state of calibrated low expectations, basically, where you really don't know how much more time you can spend in this far-off, strange world that he's authored with his collaborators, in this case, Roman Coppola, who co-wrote Asteroid City, who has been working with Anderson in the development of almost all of his features since the Darjeeling Limited. But with that in mind, and a rather long opener, I do have to say that it's probably no secret, even before getting into the review, that I really loved Asteroid City. I think it's a great film, and especially following on The French Dispatch, which I only checked out quite recently for the exact reasons I mentioned above about that uncanny sense of malaise and tempered expectations that Anderson's style seems to induce at a cultural level. Especially following The French Dispatch, which I found to be a really stunning film and possibly Anderson's best since The Life Aquatic. Especially following that, I am both surprised and pleased by how much Asteroid City works not only as a work of art unto itself, but as a testament to Anderson's abilities as a filmmaker to constantly kind of strategically underrate his own works through his style and then resolve that tension of malaise that comes with his seeming to repeat himself by surprising us and reminding us that, oh, right, he has a very distinct and inimitable style, but really, even as his style is increasingly refined, like a great artist, Wes Anderson really never repeats himself at all. That's the fiction of Wes Anderson's filmmaking. That's the meme of Wes Anderson's filmmaking that keeps attracting so many influencers and AI artist hacks to ride off of it under the false impression that they can imitate it, that they have it pinned down and distilled, when the truth is anything but. So like most of Anderson's films up to this point, Asteroid City, while having some centralizing character focus, is basically an ensemble comedy drama in the very eccentric style of narrative and character writing that we're used to from him and Roman Coppola at this point. The story of Asteroid City is presented in the frame narrative of a 1950s teleplay being presented by a very weird host played by Bryan Cranston. If I can describe Cranston's character and the aesthetic of this frame narrative, despite the fact that it's ostensibly a teleplay program, the opening narration really feels more like a parody of The Twilight Zone, except that Cranston's character is more of a strange fusion between Rod Serling of The Twilight Zone, but mixed with the kind of wooden awkwardness of an actor like Raymond Burr in the original Godzilla King of the Monsters. Anyway, the frame narrative is that Asteroid City itself, in quotes, is an off-Broadway play that is now being adapted to television, and the playwright Conrad Earp is played by Edward Norton. Except when we actually get into the dramatization of the play itself, we switch from the black and white box 50s Academy ratio style of a TV program to this heightened full-color anamorphic widescreen presentation of the story proper that begins with Jason Schwartzman playing the photographer Augie Steenbeck arriving in the titular Asteroid City, which is basically just some Route 66 desert tourist trap in the middle of the New Mexico desert, where its biggest claim to fame is that it's a meteor crash site. It's got this big crater in the middle of the town where the meteorite is. The meteorite, not the asteroid. That's an inside joke. An asteroid is an orbiting body of rock. When it crashes into the Earth, it's a meteorite. I should get a meteorite in the head for saying that. God, I hate myself. Anyway, in addition to being this kind of sad, dry, empty tourist trap where the only residents seem to be the people who run the local gas station and diner, and Steve Carell as the motel manager who also sells small plots of land out of a vending machine. In addition to that, Asteroid City being very close to a military and scientific installation where the U.S. government tests atom bombs that are periodically seen exploding off in the distance, it is also the location of basic basically a youth science competition, and Augie's son, Woodrow, Jake Ryan, is one of the kids selected to present his device. And so, while there are a lot of eccentric little threads and B-plots going on with the increasingly rather large and gangly ensemble cast that convenes upon Asteroid City, that's the main establishing point of the fictional Earps play, that there's this youth science competition in the middle of this tourist-trapped desert town. And I could really get into the weeds of expanding upon the whole ensemble and explaining who they are, but look, you can see the trailers and look up the cast on IMDb. You already know Asteroid City is coming at you with this eccentric and star-studded cast, in the same way that from the same publicity, you more or less get a sense of the very heightened kind of cartoon universe in which the story takes place. In fact, on the cartoon tip, it seems like the primary aesthetic inspiration for the setting of the film is Chuck Jones's Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons, and in case the illusion wasn't obvious, there is even a stop-motion animated Roadrunner that does appear periodically in the film, just so it's clear as possible, yes, this is a Chuck Jones cartoon universe. And I honestly don't want to spoil too much about the various eccentric ensemble elements of the movie, because that's the thing, that's what the movie is about. That's what a lot of Wes Anderson's movies are kind of about, as he's built upon his style, is just living in this heightened world and just kind of luxuriating in all of these eccentric characters and their interactions and the strange, sometimes funny, sometimes very stark and melancholy places that their individual stories take them in the context of a larger, convoluted, though intentionally convoluted experience. And the thing that you really need to know just to get a basic comprehension of the broadest possible skeleton of the story of Asteroid City, that is, Asteroid City, the play within the TV program within the movie, the thing you need to know is that after this youth science competition, and as everyone in the ensemble is assembled in the crater around the meteorite, not the asteroid, they're all assembled to watch this once-in-a-lifetime celestial event, and suddenly a big glowing green flying saucer comes down from the sky and hovers over the crater, and a very strange-looking, wide-eyed black alien comes out of the ship, silently and awkwardly takes the meteorite, and then just leaves, after which everyone in the town is quarantined by the military. Now, you may be saying, Ian, you didn't need to spoil the fact that an alien appears. Like, they refer to an alien in the trailers, but they never show it, and they never show how it appears or when. Why did you spoil that? But here's the thing. The movie itself spoils the appearance of the alien before you even see it. Because intermittently throughout Asteroid City, we break away from the play within a TV show to the separate heightened reality of the TV show itself. And there we get a periodic background glimpse into the fictional cast of the play, Asteroid City, as well as the writer and director of the play, all presented in its own black and white teleplay style. And in one of the first scenes, which involves Jason Schwartzman as the actor trying out for the role of Augie Steenbeck for the playwright Conrad Earp, the reading he does for his audition is not just a scene that refers to the fact that there's going to be an alien in the play, but it comes from a climactic scene from the play. So even though in the play within a teleplay, we're still just in the first act of the play, suddenly we cut away to a completely separate story in which the characters give away a scene from the climax of the play. And not only that, not only is Asteroid City periodically cutting back and forth between the play within a play and the frame narrative, but gradually you start to realize that there are scenes from the play that we are not being shown in favor of these interstitial stories about the writing and casting and making of the play. And then finally, we realize that the broader narrative of Asteroid City, besides all of the ensemble narratives from within the play, the broader narrative is actually about the development of this play itself and the individual unseen, behind-the-scenes experiences of the people who made it, and even people who apparently don't end up being in the play itself. And that may not be the clearest synopsis of the movie there can be, but it's the best sense of the movie that I can give you in trying to convey the more complex, intuitive, experiential nature of the film. And so Asteroid City really represents a progression of Anderson as a writer and filmmaker, especially since The Grand Budapest Hotel and then with The French Dispatch. This idea of his films being increasingly less focused, even as they are often ensemble films, increasingly less focused on a single overarching narrative, and instead being oriented towards this strange, freewheeling approach to writing in which even within a relatively straightforward story, there are stories within stories that are enfolded within them and interrupt each other and come on top of each other, that are often just as important, if not more so emotionally and thematically, than the real story that Anderson is telling, so to speak. But even to that extent, this represents a really rather radical progression on Anderson's part, and eventually Asteroid City reaches this point where it's not just vacillating back and forth between competing narratives, but even reaches a point where Anderson gets so much more psychological and surreal and even nightmarish than anything he's ever done before. Like, the style of the film is so obviously his own, but frankly, the tone of Asteroid City feels so much more in tune with a more radical kind of experimental cinema and avant-garde. I mean, for all the various layers of allusions to different authors and playwrights and animators and filmmakers that inform the style of every individual Anderson film, Asteroid City feels almost more like a Guy Madden movie than anything else, especially The Forbidden Room from 2015, where you see, I think, a very similar approach to constantly unfolding story within a story into a kind of nightmarish fugue where you become so caught up in the craftsmanship of the film itself, but you also kind of find yourself becoming kind of lost within the constantly complicating narrative upon narrative, where what comes out of it is a greater appreciation for the film as this experiential piece, where Anderson as a filmmaker is really challenging his audience to pick up the threads for themselves and find their own story in the work, to project their own emotions against the constantly unfolding tableau that he creates. And this really gets into the thing that is so fascinating about Anderson's style as a filmmaker, again, as this guy who, even when his movies are consistently well received, is perhaps the king of being accused of having style over substance, self-indulgent approach, where he's only just constantly repeating and refining his aesthetics, but not really relating to the audience or advancing or progressing in his craft. What Asteroid City proves, if anything, is that what defines Anderson as a filmmaker is that he is a stylist. He does have such an incredibly specific vision that you are compelled to accept in often primarily sensorial and experiential ways, and where he is constantly distilling and refining his style so that with each work, and as it becomes memeified, and as we have this kind of creeping malaise when we're wondering, isn't this just the same thing over and over again? All of these things are true, but then what is also irrefutable is that Anderson does all of these things, but then at the same exact time never repeats himself, is always growing as a filmmaker, is always expanding upon the potential of his craft, is always at the same time as he is defining what the rules, so to speak, of his cinematic works are, is also constantly breaking the rules and challenging the boundaries of cinema, doing something radical and new with it, and something that is not only inimitable unto himself, but is also so strangely and inextricably part of his larger body of work, but also completely unlike everything that came before it. I can totally understand some people going into Asteroid City and being alienated by and frustrated by it, being bored by it. In fact, there was a lady sitting 2 seats away from me in the theater who fell asleep and was snoring at one point, but I blame that more on the curse of reclining seats in movie theaters than anything else. I can understand being alienated by it, but for my money, I found Asteroid City to be not only a beautifully made movie, not only an aesthetically beautiful film, but a beautiful piece in its kind of convoluted, sublime exploration of creation and the relationship between artists and their art, the unseen stories behind the scenes, so to speak. And for as funny as the film is, also another great example of how Anderson can tap into such a degree of nightmarish melancholy and pain beneath all of this apparent whimsy. And I do want to say that this is a very funny movie. It's definitely got Anderson's quintessential quirky, offbeat sense of humor. It's not going to work for everybody, but even if you're looking for a more conventional style of narrative and come away disappointed, there is still some great comedy in this movie, all of which, along with the rather understated sadness beneath it all, is facilitated by a really great cast who, besides the heretofore mentioned, includes Scarlett Johansson, Tom Hanks, Jeffrey Wright, Hope Davis, Liev Schreiber, Tilda Swinton, Adrian Brody, Jeff Goldblum, and also a really nice run of younger actors who do really well continuing Anderson's great trajectory of having great facility with young actors in particular. It is an experiential film. It is not a conventional narrative, and so you do need to go into it prepared for the fact that this is an art house film. This is just an art house film that happens to be getting mainstream distribution push because the last 2 movies the director made were very successful. And so you have to go into it with that in mind, that this is a film in which we are shown a lot of different parts of different stories, but are never necessarily given the conventional resolve of any one main story. I would even say that die-hard Wes Anderson fans might not be prepared for just how rather experimental and avant-garde he is being with this film, but I thought it was utterly fantastic. Probably not as good as The French Dispatch, but there's certainly some incredible, fantastic, and challenging stuff that Anderson is doing here. And so with a solid 4 out of 5 for Asteroid City, I do kind of want to conclude this review by speaking to all of the Anderson imitators, especially the most recent variants of them that have cropped up among social media influencers on the one hand and those AI artists on the other who seem to think it's really cool and fun to like tell a predictive algorithm to spit out like what it would look like if Wes Anderson directed Star Trek or whatever. Look, and I say this from the heart and I say it with love. There are a lot of you out there who I understand are just having fun and are really liking the attention that you can get from paying homage to, or rather ripping off, Wes Anderson. And it probably is fun. You're probably having more fun making that than I am simply describing Asteroid City, sitting out here sweating my off. But the thing that you need to understand is that what all of these imitations of Wes Anderson prove is that his style is so fundamentally inimitable. I know you think that because you've got a center-framed shot or use forced perspective that you've figured out how to create something that looks like something good. But the thing you need to understand is that it's not good. What you're doing is hack. And it's not just hack because it's purely imitation. What you're doing is hack because you're not even imitating well. I do not see any of these Anderson imitators doing much beyond simply doing center-framed, symmetrical shots or quirky interstitial titles. I do not see any of the other hallmarks I associate with his style, which is something you can easily pick up by just paying attention to his movies and maybe actually writing down what it is that you're seeing rather than presuming that you just understand it intuitively. Like, I know a lot of people really bag on film school and film studies in general, but that's actually a really useful tool that film studies can give you, which is the capacity to realize, oh, you can't really just understand movies intuitively, especially in terms of their craft and style. You kind of actually have to consciously watch it and describe to yourself what you're seeing and try to research and explain what it's doing. And in the case of Wes Anderson, look, for the love of God, think about how he uses camera movement. Pay attention to all those shots where he doesn't frame his actors in the center. And if anything, he tends to frame his central subject of a shot just off-center than anything else. And quite frankly, pay attention to the fact that, no, I'm sorry, Anderson's photography is almost never symmetrical. It's actually more in character of his style to really play with the sense of balance in an image, to really crowd the image with a lot of stuff so that we're kind of overloaded with visual information and we don't often know where to look, where there's this freedom to the tableaus that he creates in terms of where our eyes are attracted, and that he can use to, again, tell stories within stories and flesh out the uncanny reality of his heightened artificial worlds that he creates. Also, pay attention to how he uses frames within frames and the ways that he uses not only squares but also triangles to break up and balance the image. Look, I could go on, but the thing I want to impress to all the young, hot-blooded Anderson imitators is that you guys are basically the victims of the memification of Wes Anderson, but you're not actually learning from Wes Anderson. His style is attractive to you, especially in this day and age, as a source of imitation because it's the sort of thing that you think you can plug into an algorithm or boil down to a set of rules and spit out something and then say, look at this thing I worked so hard on, look how it looks so good, just like this really great filmmaker that I'm imitating. And it doesn't look good. I'm sorry, it looks like And again, it doesn't just look like because it's only imitation, and it doesn't even just look like because you're imitating badly. It looks like because you are approaching the process of even crafting something that looks like a Wes Anderson film from the perspective of what are the rules of Anderson's highly refined, distilled style of how I have come to understand it, easily reproducible content rather than art. But here's the rub, ladies and gentlemen. The reason Wes Anderson is a great filmmaker is not because he has a highly refined and distilled set of rules. The reason he's a great artist is because his command of his craft is such that he presents a tableau to you and makes you think there are rules. It makes you think it has a symbolic order. It makes you think it is wholly contained and irrefutable content of elements. Anderson's brilliance is that he makes his films at first look so meticulously rules-based, but only so that over the course of the film, he can set about strategically breaking not only the conventional rules of cinematic realism and conventional narrative, but also his own rules of order, so that you're watching his films and he is constantly jolting you and shocking you out of your complacency with the image, so that you are struck by the vitality and the chaotic potential of even this apparently repressed, highly ordered, totalitarian image. Imitating Wes Anderson is like imitating Picasso. Picasso's paintings only look the way they do because he has a highly trained sense of what the rules of his craft were, and then he set about breaking them to inspire the spectator with something unique and different, so that you're not just looking at a painting or an image that looks good, but you're mapping your own chaotic emotional experience onto it and coming away not with an answer of what made this art great, what are the rules of what made this art great, but with the question of why did this have the effect on me that it does? And that's, of course, a question that you might never answer, which is always the terror of art, which is often why it is so hard for even people who want to make art to make it, because they're not prepared to confront the terror of chaos and unknowing, basically. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm already getting ahead of myself, but I was really getting ahead of myself with that one. Back to the point. Leave aside whether or not you'll be as good an artist as Wes Anderson, because most likely you will not. But if you're going to be even a mediocre good artist at all, you're never going to get there by looking at another artist's highly refined style, distilling it to those apparent rules, and following them. Great artists may steal from their influences, but great artists also steal from their influences so that they can break the rules of what influences them. So if you want to learn from Wes Anderson, you should be paying attention to where he sets up what you think is the vantage by which you understand what he's doing, but then interrupts it, breaks it. You don't learn his rules, you learn from him by how a great artist breaks the rules. In fact, if you look at Asteroid City, you'll see plenty of Anderson's own influences, from Chuck Jones to Steven Spielberg to Stanley Kubrick to Yoshijiro Ozu to Akira Kurosawa, Alfred Hitchcock even. He takes these influences and he even meticulously imitates the rules of his influences, but then he breaks them. And you can learn from a great artist by how he breaks the rules, whereas all the while, as that art becomes infused into the general zeitgeist of contemporary art and popular culture, you also learn how this great artist is constantly building upon, progressing, and breaking the rules of his own craft. But where even people who respect his works, even diehard fans who love his works, are hardly aware that he's doing anything at all, where he remains so fundamentally invisible as a creator because the art has its own vitality. The art has its own living, creative force beyond him. And that's very appropriate for Asteroid City, a movie that not only breaks a lot of rules of not only conventional cinema, but also supposed rules internal to its own creator's own body of works, but is also very much about the strange extent to which an artist can at once be so distinctive in their voice, be so inimitable and strange and offbeat in their style, and yet somehow always remain distant and obscure and invisible in the face of his own creation. That's gonna do it anyway. No Hard Feelings and Asteroid City, folks. Two really good films. Very happy to recommend both, obviously for very different reasons, but if you're going to spend a night out at the movies, you really can't go wrong with either or both of these options. I did the double feature route, and I was incredibly pleased by my selections. That being said, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was another episode of the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys again next time.